Thanks so much for joining us. Tom Leyden, Dave Birkett from the Detroit Free Press. A lot to chew on, and frankly, all we're going to do in this little webcast is just have a conversation which I'm sure is similar to the conversations that you're having with your friends if you're a Lions fan. There have been a lot of them over the course of the last week. A lot of anger, a lot of opinions shared, a lot of frustration, a lot of natural questions which come about. Now, clearly, Dave's the guy to go to because he got the one-on-one with Ndamukong Suh that you can see in today's Detroit Free Press. We'll hit that first. There's also the whole profile on Haloti Ngata, which we'll get to, but I think the Suh thing is just so interesting beyond what you wrote, because it's what you saw in his eyes, what you felt from his presence on Friday, because what a whirlwind for him to sign the deal, but also realize that that 5-year period of his life is coming to an end. And it appeared, based on what he said, that there was some genuine interest and belief that he was going to come back here.
Yeah, look, I think he's a very complex individual, and I don't know that people are going to believe everything that he said in there. You know, there's certainly, it's his word, and you know, he's a guy that has not always, or whose word has been questioned in the past, but he did. That's what he said. He said he wanted to be a Lion, he hoped to be a Lion, that his goal was to stay in Detroit, but obviously it got to a point where the business side of football took over, and he was not going to come back to the Lions. And as for what he thought, you know, it's impossible to get inside him, but I truly felt, you look at some of those comments, I mean, the length of some of those quotes, those were full quotes, and anybody who's been around him in past, the past 5 years knows that he does not typically speak, you know, in those sort of thoughts. You know, he just doesn't share that much. And so I do think there was a lot of truth to what he was saying, that, you know, he liked his time in Detroit. The city will always be a part of him. But at the end of the day, he's a businessman who plays football. The money in Miami was just too good to pass up.
You know, I couldn't help but watch nearly every interview that Suh did with the guys who do my job down in Miami. And the one thing I took away from it is like, oh my God, they're where I was 5 years ago. You know, they're asking all the same kind of questions and very excited about him being here. They don't necessarily know what he's like on a day-to-day basis and how sometimes he can be difficult. And it made me think that, you know, maybe there's a part of him that just wanted to turn the page and get this 5-year period behind him and start fresh with a new group of people in a new situation and see if he might be able to reinvent his image a little bit. We're in a new uniform in a new situation.
It's interesting you say that, because I think you're right that had he stayed in Detroit, I don't know that that image would have changed at all. I mean, this was who he was, and the one comparison that he made to me was, he said it's a lot like, you know, college, that he went to, you know, from Portland to Nebraska, and Portland was always a part of him and always will be, and then, you know, he had to leave Nebraska and he went to the NFL, and he still, you know, loves Portland or loves Nebraska, and Nebraska was always a part of him and always will be. And in Detroit, the same way, that he went to Detroit, but maybe it was time to leave in some regard, you know, and maybe this is the next chapter, that he grew up here in some ways. I think we saw that in the locker room a lot. I mean, he wasn't always the most open with us. He rarely was open with us, but behind closed doors, he did. The last couple of years, you saw him interact with his teammates a lot more. You saw him do a lot more in the defensive line room this year with some of those guys that he was really close with, Ziggy Ansah, Karan Reed, some of those guys. He grew up a little bit, so maybe this was him leaving the nest again for you know, another time to go to, you know, maybe the final chapter of his football career.
Let's go back to when all the restructures happened and how ultimately I think that cost the Lions. Now, let's say this, and you pointed this out to me earlier today when we talked about it. Had they not done those restructures, he still would have gotten how much as a franchise?
A little over $19.5 million the franchise, about $19.5 million.
Which is more than he's making this year from Miami. So it's not like it would have been cheap, but people see the 19.5 compared to the 27.9 and said, okay. So I get how they hop on that. Let's talk about the missteps, and more importantly, because you don't want to dwell so much in the past, how can they learn from him, and what can they do to restock this team? We'll get to Ngata shortly.
Yeah. Well, no, with the Suh thing, you know, I think you're right. I mean, it's my belief that, and I think the Lions would argue that, you know, they, had it not been for some of the contractual missteps they had in the past, the cap management that they had in the past, that they would have been able to franchise him for that $19.5 million. It would have been much more palatable, at least, than the $27 million was. And it still would have been a lot of money, a ton of money, but you keep your best defensive player around that way. I think had they not done those restructures, you know, they would have more money to spend now in free agency too. Had they not, you know, kept Ndamukong Suh, he would not have had the same amount of leverage that he had. So I think there's a whole lot that goes into that. But that being said, the the old CBA, the fact that the Lions had Kelvin Johnson, Matthew Stafford, Suh under contract, it really is difficult to keep three premier players, pay them that much money, make them the cornerstones of your team. I understand why they did not do that at the end of the day. There was a chance, I think, that they could have got something done last year. The Lions believe they did all they can. Suh's side will tell you that, they thought something could have got done last year, but when it came down to it, it wasn't going to happen here in the last 2 weeks.
All right, before we talk about Haloti Ngata, well, let's close the chapter on Nick Fairley. Somewhat symbolic, we were both there as he got hurt in London, that his career as a Lion ends that way. A guy who was expected to do basically what Suh has done to a certain extent, maybe not at the same level, but even Gunther Cunningham said he was a close second. Right. Fairley said that, he said that Fairley was right there. Where did his career here in Detroit go off the rails, and what are the concerns you think, based on what you've learned, that the Lions may have about him?
It's the bulk of it is injury related. You look back to what they didn't do last year when they had a chance to pick up the fifth-year option on his rookie contract for $5.477 million, a relatively small amount, and they decided not to do that, not to protect themselves, give themselves that insurance in case Ndamukong Suh left. I think that spoke volumes about what they thought about him. And he's never played 16 games in a season. He missed 8 games this year with the knee injury. He's had shoulder problems in the past. He's had foot problems in the past. The work ethic, the diet habits that he had, those were all an issue. He seemed to correct some of those and seemed to get himself right in those areas, but it wasn't going to be enough for the Lions to trust him on a long-term deal. And the contract that he got in St. Louis, $5 million, $7.5 million, including incentives, I think a lot of teams around the NFL felt that way.
Okay, lost in the shuffle, and maybe you should have held this off till tomorrow. This could have been tomorrow's front page news, but Ngata, you did a great job with another profile of him, and here's a guy who comes in. My concern, obviously, as most fans' concern would be, is his age and his experience and the tread on that tire and how long he can really be a significant contributor here in Detroit. I go back to Kyle Vanden Bosch. When he shows up, everyone sees him as a dominant force coming off the Pro Bowl appearances, but you saw the body begin to break down. You can't compare player to player, but I'm going to try. How do you compare a veteran like Ngata coming in to maybe a veteran like Vanden Bosch coming in at the time?
Well, working in Haloti's favor is that he's rarely missed games, because of injury in his career. He was suspended 4 games last year. For using Adderall, that's one thing. But 31, I still think he has a couple good years left in him. He's certainly not the player he was. He made 5 straight Pro Bowls. Didn't have his best year last year, even before the injury, and Baltimore survived without him. I think that was part of the Ravens' thinking, along with the salary that he was making. But he's still a really good player. He can be a dominant nose tackle, stopping the run, and I think that's what the Lions need as much as anything from that defensive line. So that's what they're counting on him to do. Let Ziggy Ansah, George Johnson, some of those other guys get after the passer. We'll see whether it works out. They gave up 2 mid-round picks, 4th and 5th rounders that they need. Maybe that's a steep price for a guy who was going to be cut, but I think he was the best guy that was going to be available at the position that they needed, and therefore it was the right thing to do.
What did you learn about him in the first couple of days? I know you've been multitasking and focusing on Suh a little bit, but the time you got to spend with Haloti, what did you learn about him, talking to him person to person?
Yeah, well, I wrote today, he's a guy that's, he's certainly not as complex as Suh, but he's been shaped by some really prominent events in his life. His father passed away in a trucking accident. He was a truck driver. The cab flipped over as he was going up an on-ramp, and he drowned in mud, essentially, in a few feet of mud. The passersby tried to help him, and they couldn't. And his mother, a couple years later, as he left school early so he could help take care of her. She was ailing at the time. She had a heart attack while she was getting dialysis and passed away. So 2 of the most prominent people in his life have not been around to see an ounce of his NFL career. And I think that is motivation. He talked a little bit about wanting to make them proud. The people that know him, I talked to some people from his past, his old high school coach, guys that he's played with in the past, and they all said that this is a driven guy. This is a really good guy off the field. There's going to be no issues with him. He's sort of a quiet guy too, a quiet sort of leader type, but they said that they think what happened in Baltimore, the way that things went down there, the suspension that he had last year, the fact that they were going to release him, they think that's going to motivate him to have a really big year this fall.
Wow, an incredibly comprehensive view at the past and the future of the Lions defensive line. You deserve, honestly, a round of applause for just an awesome week of work. And it's the topic that more people are talking about this week than anything else, which is amazing when you think about the fact that the Red Wings are headed towards the playoffs. Michigan State's playing in the Big Ten tournament. The Tiger season's upon us. It just goes to show how incredibly powerful this franchise is and how immensely insane this market would be
Yes,
if the
crazy.
Lions were to make this happen. So go home and get some rest.
I need some. I appreciate that.
And if you haven't, I highly recommend you picking up even the paper version. This is one of those newspapers today that you go out and you get the paper version and you sit on your porch and you just spend 20 minutes reading these two stories because they're incredibly insightful. And I'm thrilled that we were able to have Dave with us on the 7 Sports Cave today and also on this special webcast. So that'll wrap it up. We encourage your feedback all the time. You can always find Dave on Twitter at Dave Birkett. I'm at Tom Leyden. Plenty to chew on, plenty to talk about. And thanks for joining us here today.